Hello everyone, welcome to yet another session of the Daily News Analysis by SRIRAM'S IAS, where we take up the important articles featuring in the Hindu newspaper and break them down for our understanding from the UPSC examination point of view. So let's start our today's discussion by taking the important articles which feature in the New Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper. So with this, let's take up our first article for the day. The first article which appears in the newspaper reads, "Who should pay for climate change?" Now, this particular article appears in the newspaper because currently what was ongoing and which is now concluded is the Conference of Parties 27 or the COP27 meeting, which is the annual meeting, the flagship meeting on climate change, where the thought leaders, researchers, the leaders of the countries all get together and deliberate upon a very impending danger of the concept of climate change. So this is a very important convention that takes place every year, and this is the 27th edition of it, which took place in the Sharm el Sharif, which is a port city in the state of Egypt. So this particular meeting is happening in which took place in Egypt, and as I mentioned, it was to deliberate upon the various aspects of climate change. So through this article, we'll try to understand what has been the journey of combating climate change by various countries right now. What does the discussions and the debates on climate change stand up right now with respect to what are the questions that are surrounding many countries, and have the previous climate change conventions yielded any result? So we'll first try to take the concept from the beginning, where right from the time where 2 decades ago the concept of climate change was introduced, when it was felt that after the industrial revolution which took place in the 19th century, the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere increased, and this led to a concept known as global warming, which meant that the temperature of the earth was warming than at a faster rate than it usually was, and this phenomenon was linked to a concept known as climate change, which meant that the climate of the world essentially is changing, which can have tremendously harmful effects on human environment and human health. So when this concept came out, it was in the year 1994 that the COP also came under the United Nations Climate Change Framework Convention, or the UNFCCC was signed, which was formed in the year 1994. So the concept of climate change came to be recognized at this time, and this UNFCCC was established to work towards stabilization of greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. So it laid out a list of responsibilities for the member states, which included formulating measures to mitigate climate change, cooperating in preparing for the adaptation of the impact, promoting education, training and public awareness related to climate change, and this was signed by 198 parties including India, China and the USA. And since then on, these parties have been meeting every year in the form of the Conference of Parties, right? So most significant of them, let's take an overlook of what these 27 meetings have yielded up until now. So the first conference was held in the year 1995 in Berlin, and then an important Conference of Parties was the third one, which was held in Kyoto in 1997, which famously came to be known as the Kyoto Protocol, which was adopted. It commits the member states to pursue limitation or reduction of greenhouse gas emission. And then came the Conference of Parties 8, where India hosted the 8th edition in New Delhi, and it laid out several measures including strengthening of technology transfer in all relevant sectors including energy, transport and research and development, and the strengthening of institutions for sustainable development. And then came the major event of the Conference of Parties 21, which took place in Paris. This is the most known by everyone as well, which is the most important as well, which took place in 2015 in Paris, where the countries agreed to work together to limit the global warming to well below 2%, preferably at 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial revolution era levels. So this is the background with respect to how the climate change negotiations have been going until now. So can we say that they have yielded any substantial results? It's very difficult to say so, because much of the time passed in convincing the leaders of the concept of climate change and the impact that it will have. So where is the Conference of Parties 27th situated, and what importance does it hold? So when the climate change conversations went this far, it was realized that a lot of discussions were done on lot of aspects, but a significant aspect came to the fore. Let's understand by the example of Pakistan. So we saw that the state of Pakistan in the previous months suffered through unprecedented range of floods, the kind of floods which Pakistan hadn't ever seen before in the history of its existence. So it was seen that this particular occurrence of floods in Pakistan, this resulted into $30 billion of damage of which can be accounted in the form of loss to life, loss to property, loss to all the infrastructural damage that was done. And apart from this, whenever a country faces such an impact of an unprecedented climate event, which is now seen as a major impact of climate change, that it was because of climate change, the glaciers in and around Himalayas are melting faster than usual, which is why Pakistan faced such unprecedented kind of floods. So it is seen that the damage which certain countries face, it is due to this impact of climate change. And with respect to Pakistan, the damage is said to be around $30 billion. The present damage as well as the kind of damage which would accrue even in future, because when such an unprecedented and catastrophic event takes place, it does not just cause a damage in the present state, but it also causes a lot of damage towards the future, and a lot of money is required to reinstate the position that the region was earlier in. That is why the amount of damage with respect to Pakistan is said to be around $30 billion. So when we talk about the damage that a region faces with respect to climate change, a lot of developing nations and the global south nations in these negotiations have a view that it is because of the emissions that were done by the developed nations, countries such as the USA or the European nations which can be considered developed right now. It is said that it was these countries which were a major part of the Industrial Revolution, which means that it was the act of these countries that has caused the major impacts of climate change, one can say. And therefore, when the events of climate change are being faced right now by those regions which did not even have a substantial part to play in causing the climate change. So for example, when we talk about Pakistan's contribution to climate change or the carbon dioxide emissions, it is only 0.7% of the total carbon dioxide emissions. So we can see that when it comes to discussions on climate change and this whole debate on climate change, the actors or the perpetrators who caused the climate change were the developed nations and their likes, who reaped the benefit of burning fossil fuels at that time and made sure that their development was reached. And now in line are the developing nations who not just have to take care of their development, which is the case with India, but also has to take care of the climate change contributions as well as the pledges that it has made to the Conference of Party meetings. So in this case, it was seen that an important concept should be discussed, which is called the loss and damage concept. So what does loss and damage funding mean? So as this concept is not a new concept and has always been in the discussions with respect to the climate change discussions, but it would be out of the official agenda. This year is special because in the Conference of Parties 2027, the loss and damage funding has been taken as an official agenda. So this is a significant news, because this at least marks that this particular issue would be formally discussed in the meeting between the parties. So what is this loss and damage funding? So when we talk about the irreparable loss and the disproportionate perpetrators who have caused the damage, and the damage which is being faced by the people, they are different people. So Pakistan is one example. Then most coastal nations with respect to the Pacific Ocean or the Indian Ocean, these coastal nations are facing the brunt of the climate change the most. But did they have a role to cause this impact of climate change? They did not. That is why this loss and damage funding refers to the economic and non-economic impacts of climate change, including extreme events in countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. And therefore, rich countries historically responsible for the climate crisis have bullied poorer nations to protect polluters from paying up from their climate damages. And this term was brought up as a demand in 1991 by the island country of Vanuatu, which was representing the Alliance of Small Island States. This island archipelago state exists in the Pacific Ocean, which even after being a carbon positive country, which meant that the amount of carbon that was sequestrated by the country was way more than the amount which it was released, but still this country was facing the impact of rising sea levels and hence the impact of climate change. So they brought out a principle of those countries which are causing this damage should pay the countries who are facing this damage. This is the short gist of the loss and damage funding. So let's understand a set of data with respect to how we can elaborate or corroborate this claim of loss and damage. So our world in data.org cites data from the Global Carbon Project to show that between 1751 and 2017, 47% of the carbon dioxide emissions came from the US and the EU of the 28 nations. So in all, just 29 countries led to 47% of the total carbon emissions in the initial era. Then this is attributable to the US, where between 1990 and 2014 caused losses that are concentrated around 1 to 2% of the per capita GDP across many nations in South Africa, in South America, Southeast Asia, where temperature changes have likely impacted labor productivity and agricultural yields. So it is these countries who did not even contribute to the climate change are now facing such unprecedented level of damage that there is decrease in labor productivity, the agriculture of that region has gotten impacted, and there's also an increasing aspect of climate refugees, where people who are not able to stay in those regions which are impacted by climate change have to migrate from that particular region. So this report says that India is also among the top 7 emitters. Now, where does India stand in this debate? So, India is in a dual position where, as I mentioned before, India also has the responsibility to take care of its development agenda. So, therefore, it cannot just immediately stop the use of fossil fuels, but also at the same time, it also has to take care of the climate change pledges. So, with respect to that, India at present does stand in the top 7 emitters, others being China, the EU, Indonesia, Brazil, and the Russia and US. These 7 plus the international transport accounted for 55% of the global greenhouse gas emissions in 2020, and collectively the G20 members are responsible for 75% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. But the case of India is that India has not emitted carbon dioxide from the pre-industrial or industrial levels, the time where obviously India was a colony and was not able to do that. And even now, the world average per capita greenhouse gas emissions is way lower than other countries. So this means that what we mean by per capita greenhouse gas emissions is that how much carbon dioxide emission can be attributed to per person of the country. So India's population being high, as well as the amount of carbon dioxide that is emitted, is way lower than other countries, where the per capita average is 6.3 tons of CO2, and for the US is way above this level, which stands at 14, followed by 13 in Russia, 9.7 in China, and India remains far below at 2.4. So India's per capita greenhouse gas emission is way lower, and this makes a case for India that India is not very much at the top of the race in terms of carbon dioxide emission, and there is also need for India to phase out of the fossil fuels gradually, and such shift cannot happen immediately. So this is the case where India stands, and therefore the principle of loss and damage becomes very important in this particular meeting where the polluter pays principle is actually applied. So this is a principle which we also find in our Indian environment laws, wherein the person who has polluted the environment or ecosystem should have the responsibility to pay, and its purpose is to work as a deterrent. Only when the climate change would be linked to its economic losses and the perpetrators of the climate change are forced to pay, it would work as a deterrent for the curbing the carbon dioxide gas emissions. So what do the Western nations or the developed nations have to say on this principle? Obviously, that these developed nations are very reluctant. Up until now, they were so reluctant that this wasn't even on the official agenda. This year, at least, this particular principle has come on the official agenda. And these countries have major issues with respect to this loss and damage funding, where these countries do not want to essentially accept the liability that it was by these countries that the phenomenon of climate change was triggered, and they fear that once this funding mechanism starts, there can be other aspects of liability also which can be put on them. That is why they are very wary of accepting this funding mechanism. So now it remains to be seen. It's a good step right now that at least this issue has been come in the mainstream. Now it remains to be seen how official this funding mechanism gets, and does it get a green flag in its true sense or not. So with this, we finish this issue, and let's move on to our next issue for the day. The next article which appears in the newspaper reads, "This unseating of vice chancellors is faulty." Now this particular article appears in the editorial section of the newspaper, which talks about the ever heated up issue which we are seeing right now in various states of India, which is between the state government and the governor of that state. So we are hearing a lot of cases from Kerala, Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, where the clashes between the chief minister and the governor is on, and one important area where their clash is on is with respect to the appointment of vice chancellors. So this particular article is written by PDT Achari, who is also the former Secretary General of Lok Sabha. He is very consistent in writing in the newspaper with respect to the political issues, and we'll take a look at this article where he feels that the ruling that the Supreme Court has given with respect to the appointment of vice chancellors and the interpretation of essentially Article 254, how it is faulty and what is the missing link in this issue between the governor and the state CM and the state cabinet with respect to the appointment of vice chancellors. So let's understand what has happened until now. When it comes to conflict between the state government and the governor, the conflict has on the context of appointing vice chancellors is not just there in one state. It is there in it is on right now in Kerala. It was there in Tamil Nadu. It was existing in Gujarat. It is also existing in West Bengal. These are areas where the essential conflict is about who would appoint the vice chancellors for the state universities. Now we all should know that the chancellors of all state universities under the provisions of the constitution is the position of the governor, where governor is the chancellor of all state universities. Now the next point comes as to who would appoint these vice chancellors. So under the UGC guidelines or the University Grants Commission guidelines, it is the state government who will form a committee who would decide on multiple names on who should be named as the vice chancellor, and then under the governor's seal, the vice chancellor would be appointed. This is the mechanism, but the appointment of a vice chancellor came into conflict in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has given two judgments in the recent past. One was in the case of Gujarat governor issue, where the Supreme Court quashed the appointment of the incumbent vice chancellor on the ground that the search committee did not form a panel for the appointment of the vice chancellor and therefore was not in accordance with the UGC regulations of 2018. This was the Gujarat case. Now in the recent Kerala case also, the appointment of the vice chancellor of the APJ Abdul Kalam Technological University in Trivandrum was challenged on the ground that the search committee recommended only one name, which is against the UGC regulations again. And this challenge succeeded, and the court quashed the appointment of the vice chancellor on the ground that provision relating to the search committee in the University Act is repugnant to the UGC regulations and was therefore void. These judgments, one can say, went in the favor of the governor or the center, one can say in one aspect that this particular judgment has favored. So here is where the author comes in and says that this particular interpretation of Article 254 and the relationship between the UGC regulations and the state law is a faulty one. How? Let's see. First, let's talk about the Vice Chancellor. The Vice Chancellor is the lead university's academic and administrative departments. They may serve on several university councils, assist with policy development and academic planning, prepare budgets, and maintain the institution's positive image. So as per the UGC Commission's guidelines, the Vice Chancellor shall appoint the Vice Chancellor out of the panel of names recommended by the Search cum Selection Committee. This was the committee that we were talking about, and the Governor is the Chancellor of these universities. So where does the UGC come in this? So although education comes under the concurrent list, which means that it is this list where both center and state can make a law on it. And here is where the confusion arises as to whether it's the center's responsibility of appointing the Vice Chancellor or it is the state's prerogative to appoint the Vice Chancellor. So according to the Constitution in this, the UGC Act was framed, and the UGC Act under section 26 of this Act actually gave the power to UGC to make regulations. And under this UGC regulations, the Chancellor, mostly the Governor in the state, shall appoint the VC out of the panel of names recommended by the Search cum Selection Committee. So it is from this UGC regulations that the whole problem starts from. Now here is where the author suggests that these UGC regulations are against the Article 254. Now what is Article 254? Article 254 majorly says that whenever there would be a conflict between the state's law and the central law will prevail. This is the gist of Article 254. The author comes in and says that Article 254 is read wrongly over here, because when we talk about a state wanting to appoint the Vice Chancellor, or the UGC regulations asking that a search committee should be made, the conflict is essentially between the UGC regulations and the State Act. The author comes in here and says that these state acts actually are more superior to the UGC regulations, because the UGC regulations do not form a part of a central act, central law which is passed through the act of the parliament. These are generally regulations or rules under the law which do not have the same status as a law that is interpreted in the Constitution. Here is where the author feels that therefore the reading of the Article 254 by the Supreme Court has been faulty, because the court's conclusion that the provisions of the State University Acts are repugnant is a faulty one, because the repugnancy under this article relates to a state law and a substantive law made by the parliament, and the UGC regulations is not a substantive law made by the parliament. So this was the discussion with respect to the issue between the conflict of governor and the state ministry with respect to the appointment of vice chancellors. And with this, we finish today's discussion, and we meet again tomorrow with the important articles of the day. Thank you.